Greetings and welcome to day 20. Well, the reason you're staring at a pair of hands is because I need them to show you what has actually arrived. First up, the ECU. Now I've gone with the Platinum Pro, it's a Haltech, and I was tossing up, I'm not sure if I put it in a previous video, but I was tossing up between the Link and the Haltech. But upon speaking to my tuner, he has advised me that this is more than likely the best application for my vehicle. Now, in order for this to run at its best, there are a number of sensors that I have purchased, and I will show you those right now. So, first up is the Wideband Sensor. Now, this is a must if you are tuning your vehicle. Now, apart from your typical cables, what comes with it is a controller unit here, and also a weldable bung so I can place it into the exhaust system. Now, the sensor itself is a little bit different to your typical O2 sensor. Now, your typical O2 sensor is referred to as a narrow band sensor, and the reason it's called that is it's quite narrow with the information it provides the ECU. And that information is right fuel ratio, incorrect fuel ratio, and that's it. That's all it provides. Whereas a wideband sensor, the information is broader. What this provides the ECU is the exact air-fuel ratio. Now, the reason that these are more important is because the ECU can then adjust to make sure that the engine parameters are perfect and that you're not doing any damage to your vehicle or your engine. Now, there are a couple of downsides to the wideband sensor. One, they don't last as long as your typical O2 sensor or narrowband sensor. And the other one is that you have to mount these in a particular way. Now, if you don't do that, these will deteriorate quicker than if you don't mount them the correct way. Now, the correct way is, say if this is the exhaust pipe and that's down, you can't mount it like this or like that, or you shouldn't mount it like that. What it needs to be, how it needs to be mounted is on a slight angle with this sensor pointing down. Now, the reason for that is if moisture accumulates at the tip of this sensor, it will start to deteriorate. So again, make sure that it's pointed downwards. Now, the reason that they provide a weldable bung is you can't have these close to heat. It will deteriorate them. So where your typical O2 sensor sits, it's pretty much right at the exhaust manifold. Now, a wideband sensor needs to be mounted around about 600 millimeters, a minimum of 600 millimeters, away from your turbo or your exhaust system, your manifold, so that the heat doesn't then again make it provide false information or deteriorate it further. That's why you're given that bung. Now, where I'll be mounting this is just before the cap. So the hole where your typical O2 sensor sits is going to be blocked off because that information is not required by the ECU to operate. The wideband sensor will take place of that, but if you were to mount this in the place of your O2 sensor, you will just burn it out. So that's why the bung's in there. It needs to be that far away from your exhaust manifold or the main source of heat, which is your engine. You can't have it after the cat. You need to have it before the cat, because the cat actually does interfere, because it does change the qualities of that exhaust. So that's the wideband sensor. Next up is the flex fuel sensor. Now, if you're just running standard pump fuel, you don't really need to worry about one of these bad boys. But if you're running E85, you don't have to if you're running dedicated E85, but if it's a street vehicle and you live in an area or a city where E85 isn't prevalent at every single service station, you'll be needing one of these. So I am running the vehicle, I will be running the vehicle on E85. That's it. But if I end up going for a long drive or E85 isn't available at my servo, which is only about 5 kilometers away, I will need to use pump fuel. Now, if the map was designed just for E85 and I put pump fuel in there, it's going to run atrociously. It'll be farting and spitting and carrying on, and it won't be any good. So what this sensor does, it actually detects the ratio of E85 to standard pump fuel, and then adjusts the map accordingly on the ECU. It's pretty smart, but it's handy to have in case. So for the sake of, I think it was $180, it was money well spent. If the need ever arises that I have to put pump fuel in it, I can do that without having to worry about affecting the way the vehicle or the engine runs. So along with the sensor, it actually came with a wiring harness, which needs to be wired into the ECU, and I had to buy these separately, but these are for the fuel lines to adapt onto each end. That's the way that I've gone. You don't have to go that way, but that's the way that I've gone. So that is the flex fuel sensor. Next up is the air intake temperature sensor. Now what this does is it detects the temperature of the air coming into the engine. Now from your turbo, it goes through your intercooler and back out and into the intake manifold, which is where this is to be mounted. So typically these are mounted on the pipe going into the intake manifold right before the throttle body, and what it does is it senses the temperature of the air coming in, and then the ECU will adjust the map accordingly in regards to the temperature of the air. So your engine will run more efficiently and perform better. Now because I need to redo my intake pipe, I'll be using a lighter and thinner aluminium. So I've purchased this bung so I can mount this into it. Now with your average J pipe or whatever your intake, you've got enough meat in the pipe itself to just thread it and then place that in. But if you're using thin alley, there's no way you're going to be able to thread that in there. So that's the reason I had to purchase that separately. So it comes with the wiring connector and the sensor itself, but because of my application I had to purchase that. Next, 4-bar map sensor. Now the Platinum Pro comes with an onboard 1.5 bar map sensor, which if you're living in the Stone Age is 21 pound per square inch. So I had to purchase this because I'll be running a lot more than 1.5 bar. I'm probably going to run in excess of 2 bar. Now there are different size sensors or sensors available. There is a 3 bar, but I went with a 4 bar, and the only reason I went with a 4 bar rather than a 3 is because there was only $10 difference between this and the 3 bar. I might get crazy later on down the track and might need this, so for $10 I've got it. So sensor, wiring connector, there's your map sensor. Last but not least, the CAN gauge. Now I didn't have to buy this, you don't have to buy this. This was almost 500 bucks for a gauge, but it's going to give me a lot of information. So I can set this up to show boost, air fuel ratio, air intake temperature, water temperature, oil temperature, blah 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 blah. Now if you see some of those peanuts out there that have all these gauges set up that look like a fighter jet cockpit, well, all that information can be provided with by one single gauge. That's the reason I went with this. So there's 3 gauges that I have in there at the moment. I boost, air fuel ratio, blah blah blah. I will be taking those out and I will be installing this down deep down by the A-pillar. So this 1 gauge is going to replace 10 gauges. You don't have to, but to me, my application, again, it's worth it. Now in order to use this with the Platinum Pro, they advise that you purchase this little adapter. But the funny thing is, when I bought that and the ECU arrived, guess what it comes with? You guessed it, the adapter. So if you are planning on using the CAN gauge and the website tells you to buy this, just check the contents of your ECU to see whether or not this bad boy's in there. If it is, you don't have to waste $65 buying that. Next up, downpipe. Now, as you know, I bought a full exhaust system from the turbo back. I wasn't exactly sure what sort of turbo I was going to run or anything like that, which is why I bought the full system. But with what I'm doing now, I'm going to be needing this. Now I'm just going to set this aside and I'm going to bring something else into view. But keep this one in mind. That's because this also arrived. Now this is the turbo that I did decide to go with. So this is an ATR43SS and it's from Hypergear. Now I had this made up with a T51R Mod, so it's going to scream like a jet engine. Also with an external wastegate and an 82 rear. Now when I was speaking to Tao at Hypergear, we had decided on a 63 rear. But he since spoke to me while he was actually making this up and recommended that I went with the 82. Now, he's quite the legend in the Australian scene, so if Tao says that this is the best way to go, then you listen. That's why I went with the 82. Now, the reason that I set that downpipe aside is because with the external gate, which is this one right here, I have decided that I am not going to scream it. I'm going to be plumbing it back into the exhaust system. Now there's a good reason for that. Over here in WA you can't run a screamer pipe. If a cop hears that, he'll defect you, your day's gone. And more than likely you'll have to return your vehicle's turbo system to stock in order to remove the defect notice. So as long as I plumb it back, I'm staying legal, the cops won't bother me. So by plumbing back, I mean this. So if you were running a screamer pipe and you have your wastegate sitting on here, you have basically a pipe that'll just run out to Atmo, and when that is happening, this thing screams. That's why it's called a screamer pipe. But to keep it legal, I need to plumb it back, and that's what this is for. Now this piece here has not been finally welded. I'll need to do that once I test fit or dry fit this system. I then need to get this all correct and then have this welded up. So no problems at all there. And this little baby here is for your typical O2 sensor if you're using a narrow band. Now I did mention earlier I'm using a wideband, so this will get plugged up and I'll be using the wideband sensor down here. And the catalytic converter is right there. So before the catalytic converter and well after the exhaust system, the exhaust manifold turbo. So this here will be attaching to the downpipe, and that's how the system will now be working. Now this is a high mount and not a low mount, so there is something else that I needed which came with the turbo. Well, not come with it, but I had to buy separately, and that is this adapter here. Now what that's going to do is it's going to provide enough gap between the turbo itself and the engine. Otherwise this will be hitting the engine and I won't be able to get that onto the exhaust manifold. So that there I had to have in order to avoid that issue. Now also with the turbo came a number of things like oil feed line. Again, didn't come with the turbo, sorry, I had to purchase all this separately. Various fittings, filter, and if you are running a ball bearing turbo, which this is, use an oil filter. Now if you don't, you could risk damaging the ball bearing system in there, and that's not worth it because then you have to have your turbo rebuilt prematurely. Now if you're running a journal bearing, there's a lot more room in there for the shaft and the bearing than what there is with a ceramic ball bearing, which is essentially what's in here. So again, it pays to make sure you use a filter. So that is the entire turbo system and necessary exhaust to go with it. So this is going to be a lot of fun. Last but not least, intercooler pipe kit. So the J pipe that's on the RB2025 is basically comes from the intake manifold and across to the intercooler, or from the intercooler. Now because I'm using a high mount turbo, that J pipe is actually more than likely going to foul with the turbo itself. So what I'm having to do is to create my own intake pipe, replace that J pipe completely. Now a little earlier I did mention I was putting in an air intake sensor. Now because of using a thin gauge aluminium, I am going to have to use that bung, which is what I was referring to with this stuff here. So I need to make up my own intake pipe, and I thought while I'm at it, what I will be doing as well is replacing the stock steel piping that comes from, that enters just in from the engine bay, from the turbo and then back to the intake manifold. It's all steel. So I'll be making up my own using this thing here, this kit. So it comes with 45s, 90s, U's. So I've got more than likely enough angles here to manufacture my own setup. Now it also comes with these silicon elbows, which I won't be using. Comes with some joiners, which more than likely won't be using. But the other thing that I was going to purchase, which this came with, is some T-bolt clamps. Now with your typical screwdriver type clamps, the worm drive type, they have these little ridges and divots along here. And you've done this before. You go to tighten it up, next thing you know it's just stripped because you can't get the tension that you require on it. Now with a T-bolt it works completely differently. So you can really crank these down before doing any damage to the system itself, and most of the damage will occur here where it's welded onto the band itself. But you can get a lot more tension on these than what you can with your worm drive. And the last thing that you really want to do is avoid blowing off a joiner or anything like that in your intercooler system if you're running a lot of boost, which I will be. So stock boost, your worm drive is more than likely, or is capable of performing the required duties, but if you're going to go extreme or even higher than your stock, you should think about getting your T-bolt bands. So that's why I went with this kit. Kill two birds with one stone, and what's left can go to my brother-in-law because his speed car, he's eventually going to be putting a turbocharged 4G into it, so he's going to need some of this. So he can have what's left, do what he wants with it, and I get to replace my engine bay intake system pipework. So that's everything that's arrived. Apart from a headlight restoration kit. So I'm basically going to call this as a video. There's a lot of stuff that I've shown you here and provided you with a bit of information to hopefully help you with what you're going to be doing. So I'll call this as day 20, but what I will be doing as soon as I'm finished is make a start, and there's a lot of work involved, but as I get enough footage to make a video, I'll start posting them up. But as far as this one is concerned, this one's over, and I will leave it at that, and I'll see you on day 21 where I start doing some real work. So until then, stay safe.